Hans Reichardt was 23 years old when he took his own life in 1950. He had never executed anyone. He had never even been accused of a crime. His father had, over 3,000 times. And in the town where Hans grew up, that number was the only thing anyone ever saw when they looked at him. This is really the story of one man who spent his whole life trying to prove that shame like that could be erased. It started almost 400 years before Hans was born, with a woodsman who was never supposed to hold an axe for anything but firewood. In the 1550s, in the small Bavarian town of Hof, a margrave named Albrecht II needed 3 men hanged, and he needed it done that day. Hof had no standing executioner on the payroll, so Albrecht walked into the crowd in the town square, pointed at a woodsman named Heinrich Schmidt, and ordered him to carry out the hangings. Heinrich had no training. He wasn't a criminal being punished with the task, and he hadn't volunteered. He was simply the man standing closest when the margrave decided the job needed doing now, invoking an old, half-forgotten custom that let local lords conscript any able-bodied man in an emergency. He carried out the hangings and discovered the part of the sentence nobody had explained beforehand. Once his hands had done that work, even once, even under direct order, the town decided those hands were permanently unclean. This was not punishment for a man. It was punishment for a surname. Heinrich's neighbors stopped speaking to him. Tradesmen wouldn't sell to his family. The same crowd that had gathered to watch him carry out the sentence would, from that day forward, treat him as something to be avoided rather than someone to be thanked. The town needed his hands, but rejected his blood. And when his son Franz was born a few years later, that son inherited a title he'd never asked for and could never resign from. Franz Schmidt would spend 45 years as an executioner himself, apprenticing under his own father before taking posts in Bamberg and, from 1578 onward, in the imperial city of Nuremberg. He kept a private diary of every punishment he carried out, 361 executions by his own careful count. That diary would become one of the only surviving first-person records of what this job cost the men forced into it. And it wasn't kept for the reason you'd assume. The stigma had nothing to do with skill, cruelty, or conscience. It was a civic category, and it followed a family for life. The exact restrictions varied from city to city, but the pattern stayed consistent. A town needed his hands and refused his blood. He could kill for the city, but he could not fully belong to it. In many towns, he could not join a guild, or stand as an honorable witness in court, or serve as a guardian to a child, or write a will the courts would recognize. He often could not drink in the taverns, bathe in the bathhouses, or worship beside the people whose laws he carried out. Civic law, guild custom, and local religious practice all reinforced the same boundary from different directions. Families like the Schmidts were pushed to live outside the city walls, near the slaughter yards, wherever the town already treated as unclean, and even in death, their graves sat apart from everyone else's. The guilds enforced this themselves, sometimes generations later. Even in the 18th century, tradesmen could still revolt when an executioner's son was allowed into an honorable craft. A boycott in the 1720s spread across 3 Bavarian cities and lasted 2 years before it broke. The punishment never stopped at the man who did the job. It attached itself to the surname. Part of why the stigma ran so deep is that executioner was never really one job. He was the man called when a town needed pain, blood, disease, and punishment handled somewhere out of respectable sight. From judicial torture and corporal punishment carried out ahead of a trial, to the policing of prostitution, to the disposal of diseased animals. The town needed him to be skilled, calm, and precise. But the better he did the job, the more permanently the job became his identity. A botched execution, a rope that snapped, a sword stroke that took 3 tries, could provoke a riot in the watching crowd. Schmidt was, by multiple contemporary accounts, extremely good at his work. It made no difference. Competence never bought back honor. Only blood settled that account, and his blood was already marked before he ever picked up a sword. The clearest proof that this was inheritance, not choice, is a 10-year-old boy named Louis de Morès. When his father, an executioner in a French provincial town, died in 1664, the title passed directly to Louis. He was too young to carry out the work, but not too young to inherit the shame. Regents handled the actual duties until he came of age, but the appointment itself was automatic, because on both his father's side and his mother's side, execution was simply what his bloodline did. Nobody asked a 10-year-old whether he wanted to grow up carrying out death sentences for the state. The paperwork had already decided that for him the moment his father's heart stopped. This is what these dynasties were built from, not ambition. In France, the Guillaume family held the Paris executioner's post for roughly a century, succeeded by the Sansons, whose descendant, Charles-Henri Sanson, would go on to execute Louis XVI in 1793. Families like these married almost exclusively within other executioner families, because respectable families refused to let their children marry into the trade, which meant an entire way of life got built on the other side of a door the rest of society kept sealed shut. France finally removed the formal legal disabilities from the trade in 1791, but by then, execution had already become a family world. The law changed faster than memory did. It would be easy to file this away as a strange German or French custom. It wasn't, though the record elsewhere is much thinner. In Japan, groups later known as barakumin were associated with occupations tied to death, slaughter, and ritual impurity. Another example of societies attaching inherited stigma to necessary but despised work. The German case survives in this much detail because Franz Schmidt himself left behind a diary, a rare record from inside the profession, in his own hand. Franz Schmidt did something almost no one in his position had managed. He spent 40 years quietly building a case to erase it. He took a personal vow of sobriety, unusual for a man in his line of work, at a time when many executioners drank away the isolation, and some drifted into the same crime they were paid to punish. Schmidt didn't. He built a genuine second career as a healer, treating fractures and wounds, and by his own later estimate saw more than 15,000 patients in his lifetime, a number that dwarfed the several hundred people he'd executed. That distinction mattered to him specifically. He wanted Nuremberg to remember the healer, at least as clearly as it remembered the executioner. His diary wasn't only a professional ledger. Historians who've studied it closely believe he began keeping it the moment he took the Nuremberg post in 1578, deliberately, as a record he could one day hand to someone with the power to undo what his family had lost. Every entry he wrote by candlelight in the hangman's house outside the city walls was, in that sense, a small brick in a case being built for a courtroom that wouldn't exist for another 46 years. Not for himself alone, but for the children who would carry his name after him. In 1624, in retirement, Schmidt petitioned Emperor Ferdinand II directly, asking the crown to formally erase what the petition itself called his family's inherited shame. He listed his decades of service to Nuremberg. He attached an endorsement from the same city council that had employed him for 40 years. And he described, in his own words, watching his grandfather, his father, and his own children carry the exact weight he had carried since boyhood. It worked. Schmidt secured full citizenship and civic honor his father and grandfather had died without. He spent nearly half a century proving, one healed patient, one careful record, and one petition at a time, that the stain his family carried had never actually been about who they were. Franz Schmidt won his own family's honor back from an emperor. He could not will it forward through 300 years to a family he never met. The Reichardt family had held the hereditary post of executioner for at least 8 generations by the time Johann was born in 1893, tracing the role back to roughly 1750, alongside a second trade, rendering animal carcasses, tied to the same old category of uncleanliness. Across his career, from 1924 through 1946, spanning Weimar Germany, the Nazi regime, and the immediate post-war years, Johann Reichardt carried out roughly 3,165 executions. Under the Nazi regime specifically, that number rose sharply, and among those he executed, in 1943, were Hans and Sophie Scholl, the young siblings of the anti-Nazi White Rose resistance. Johann's children paid the price Franz Schmidt's ancestors had paid 4 centuries earlier. Classmates mocked them in the schoolyard, calling their father a Kopfabschneider, a head chopper. Franz Schmidt had won honor from an emperor. Hans Reichardt lived in a century that claimed to have outgrown emperors. The old shame still knew how to find a child. After the war, denazification proceedings stripped half of Johann Reichardt's property and left him unable to pay the trial costs he owed. His marriage ended. And in 1950, his son Hans, 23 years old, took his own life, an act those who knew the family attributed directly to the shame still attached to the Reichardt name. There was never anything in the blood. There was only a job a town needed done and a decision, made again and again in different centuries by people who never had to do the job themselves, to make one family carry the shame of it instead. Heinrich Schmidt didn't choose that town square in Hof. 10-year-old Louis de Morest didn't choose his inheritance. The Reichardt children didn't choose their schoolyard. He inherited the job before he ever understood what the job meant. Franz Schmidt spent his life trying to make sure it ended with him. It didn't. It just went quiet for 300 years and found another family. Executioners weren't the only people Europe buried alive while still needing their work. Tanners, gravediggers, and knackers carried their own inherited stains. Which one should we uncover next?